So the next procedural process we want to talk about is DynaMesh Subtract. So here I have my model. Once again, the base shape was generated through the procedural process of panel loops. I then went through with just the standard brushes inside of ZBrush, masking and the transpose line, and generated some new forms and moved things around to kind of get the shape to match a little more of the actual concept we have here on our canvas. Now, we started coming through and already trimmed and carved some of these kind of areas out with the clip brushes and the trim brushes. And now I want to go through and add a little more detail to the actual model using DynaMesh and the DynaMesh Subtract process. So the first thing I want to make sure I have is an actual subtool that is selected, and it is a DynaMesh object. So I just have this middle part here. I'm just going to click this eyeball icon to just make sure that's the only thing that's visible. So I just hid all the other subtools on my model. And now I'm going to go to the Geometry tab, and I'm going to open that up. And you can see I already have the DynaMesh subpalette open, and DynaMesh is active with a resolution of 280. So with DynaMesh active, this means I can just start sculpting on the surface of my model. And then when I start to get to the point where my geometry needs a little more precision, I can easily redistribute the entire surface with even topology by just holding Control and clicking off the model, and it's going to re-DynaMesh and give me that nice even topology across the entire surface. So the DynaMesh options are really nice for just kind of this sculpting kind of process. Another thing DynaMesh uses that works really well is insert meshes. So if I hit B on my keyboard and isolate by the letter I, you're going to see all these kind of objects here or brushes here that are labeled insert meshes. So I'm just going to come down here and grab this one labeled insert cube. Just click that. Now with a insert mesh brush selected, you can just come to your model and drag out, and you're going to notice it's going to generate a piece of geometry as a brush. So it's actually generated a cube as I've sculpted on my model. Now with this cube being generated, I can now clear the mask once and then Control click off on the surface and re-DynaMesh, and you can see that that cube is now fused into the surface of my model. So this is a quick way to add intricate details and also just bulk geometry to your model while you're sculpting, so you can just really increase the kind of size and shape of the object just by using the simple insert mesh brushes. Now another function that these insert mesh brushes have is the ability to add holes or do the opposite of adding, but rather subtract. So to get this to work, I'm just going to hold Alt and do that same drag process again. And you'll notice when you did that, it's going to give you like a little translucent effect, and the actual box that we dragged on, the insert mesh, is actually inverted, so you can see the inside of it. Now with that applied, we're just going to clear our mask and then just click off on our canvas and drag one more time with Control. And we're going to see that DynaMesh is going to reactivate and then actually subtract that part of the model. Now you'll notice that the kind of edges here are a little bit distorted, and it's not really a clean subtract, and this is based on the resolution of our DynaMesh. So right now our resolution was at 280, so if I undo that process really quick, get back to here, and up my resolution to say something around 512. And now if I come in and hold Alt and drag that thing out and then clear my mask and re-DynaMesh, you're going to notice that that edge is a lot cleaner. So the DynaMesh process is dependent on your resolution of your model for how much clarity you're going to be able to get when you subtract one of those insert mesh objects. So with this functionality, we can now actually punch holes into our mesh as long as it's a DynaMesh object. So if I go to my brush menu again, I'm going to isolate by the letter I and find an insert cylinder. Just grab that object there. And I'm going to rotate my model and say I want to punch a hole right through that kind of part right there. So I'm just going to make sure it's framed on my canvas. I'm going to hold Alt and drag that cylinder out like so, and just make it something like that. Now another functionality of the actual insert mesh brushes is after you draw one, it's coming in unmasked, and so this allows you to now use your transpose lines and distort that cylinder a little bit more. So you can see if I didn't want it to embed as far as it is, I can take the transpose line and kind of move it around. Now for this process right here, for this hole, I wanted to go all the way through, and so now my insert mesh object, it starts here and ends there, so it's really not long enough to punch all the way through that surface. So I need to add a little more length to it. So I'm going to use this transpose line again and just kind of move it out a little bit just so it's on the other side. And then I'm going to take the extended line over here and just click and drag, and that's going to scale this object up. And so now I can kind of reposition this and make this area a little bit larger through here until I get that cylinder sticking out of both sides. And this is going to allow me to punch a hole all the way through my model. So there we go, something like that. And I just took the move option there and just kind of grew that cylinder a little bit more so it actually is going from this side to that internal structure. And so now if I go back to draw and clear my mask and then update the DynaMesh, you're going to see I've now punched a hole right through the surface of my object. So I can come in and just clean up those borders a little bit. You can also come to the Geometry tab here and go to Clay Polish and run a clay polish on it. The clay polish feature will look at the kind of hard edges of your model and then polish the areas in between. So this is often a really good thing to run after you do a lot of kind of hard surface DynaMesh Subtract processes to just clean up your mesh. So I'm just come over here and click clay polish, and you can see if I undo, this was before, and then the redo, it's kind of cleaned up those edges quite a bit. Now every time you run clay polish 2, it does apply a mask to your actual model. So you want to make sure you clear the mask before you continue sculpting. So if I just control click off, I'm going to clear that clay polish mask, and now I can go in and sculpt on my model like normal. So that's how you can generate kind of holes into your model using the actual insert mesh brushes and DynaMesh. Now DynaMesh also has another functionality which allows you to subtract subtools from other subtools. So I'm just going to come back over here and turn all my helmet back on, and then I'm just going to hold Alt and select this top guy up here. And now if you notice, on my actual concept I have this kind of cut carved out of the top of the helmet, and right now I don't have that. So I could use an insert mesh object and come through and just kind of apply that there and then move it around and find out good position for it and then re-DynaMesh to add that cut. But I can also just append another object into my subtool list and use that as the subtractive element. So to do that, I'm going to come over here and make sure I have my tool selected I want to subtract from. Then I'm coming down here and click on Insert, and I'm just going to insert in a cube 3D object. So as you can see, as I did that insert, I now have a new subtool right below my original one, and it's actually this cube object. So I just need to move this and kind of position it in place up to where this area is on the actual concept over here. So I'm just going to take my transpose line and use move and just kind of move it into position right about there. Now I can do anything with this actual cube right now. So if I wanted to scale it, I can go to the scale transpose line and scale it like so. I can use the move transpose line, I can use the rotate, and I just kind of move it around and deform it until it kind of looks like a similar angle and placement in relation to that form that's subtracted from the concept. So just quickly going through and using transpose and moving it around. Now it's a little bit off-centered right now, so I'm just going to take the move and just kind of move it back like so. And that looks pretty good at the rough area of where I want to do that actual subtract. So the process to get this actual subtract to work is actually pretty easy. So I'm going to go back to my main tool that I want to subtract the actual cube from. I first want to make sure it is a DynaMesh object, so I'm going to go back to my Geometry tab and go into DynaMesh, and it is an active DynaMesh object and it has a resolution of 512. So now that this is a DynaMesh object and I have this cube sitting here, I'm now going to go back to my Subtool tab, and on the actual cube subtool, I'm going to come over here and change this icon to this half moon right here. Now this half moon is going to tell ZBrush when I do this next process that I want to subtract this cube from this element here. So it's taking this top part of the helmet and subtracting that cube. So after I have that set up as that half moon little icon there, I'm going to make sure I have my original tool I want to subtract from selected, and then I'm going to come down here to the merge tab and do a merge down. It's going to tell you it's an undoable operation, so if you're doing a lot of this stuff, you probably want to go ahead and save before you do this process. I'm just going to hit OK. And now you'll notice it's taken both those tools and merged them into one subtool. Well, if I click solo here, you'll see it just has both those tools like so. If I turn on my polyframe though, you're going to notice a little bit of a difference here. So here I have my original object, which is one polygroup, and then that cube is now this white polygroup. Well, this white polygroup inside of ZBrush is telling ZBrush when next time I read DynaMesh that it's going to subtract anything with a white polygroup. So if I turn off my polyframes now and just hold Control and click off my model, it's going to subtract that white polygroup from the other part of my model. So you can see now I have that kind of area created on my mesh. Now this white polygroup can also be applied in the actual polygroup panel. So scrolling to the bottom of the tool, opening up the polygroup, and there's a button called Group as DynaMesh Sub. So if you came through your model that we have here and I just started generating, insert cylinders all over the place, but then I decided that, hey, I actually want these to be subtracted and not to be added or unioned to the actual helmet top here. Well, if I go to my polyframes, you can see I have that main part of the helmet, which is one polygroup, and then all those little cylinders are separate polygroups. So I can come through and just hold Control and Shift and isolate the main part of the helmet, and then Control and Shift again to hide that part. And now I just have those cylinders that we just inserted as the visible object on this subtool. Well, with these visible, I can come over to this polygroup tab now and now click Group as DynaMesh Subtract, and you're going to see it's going to give it that white polygroup. So now if I hold Control Shift and bring back my entire model, and I'm going to turn off polyframes, and now read DynaMesh, it's going to subtract all those items out. So if you go through the process and you merge a lot of parts in, you can always come down to the polygroup tab and use this Group as DynaMesh Subtract, which is going to give it that white polygroup, and then you can just read DynaMesh and it's going to go through and subtract those areas out on your model. So you can import in or add any type of object to your scene to kind of use as a subtraction object. So if I just come back to this one here, I can insert in, say, a cylinder, a ring 3D object, and make sure I'm out of solo mode. And then you can just move or position that object around to where you want it to go. So if I wanted to taper this section off here to give it a little bit of a curve, just move it into position there. And just do that same process where you make sure you have the object you want to subtract, just set to that subtraction option, go back to your main object, do a merge down, and then read DynaMesh, and it's going to cut that part right out. Now the actual geometry that cut is going to generate is relative to the object you're subtracting. So you can see I have a little bit of tessellation happening on the surface of the area where I just cut that ring out, and that was because that ring actually was not smooth or subdivided enough to make it appear smooth on the model. So you can see I have some of that visible geometry around the entire ring. So when you DynaMesh and do the subtract process, it's actually going to subtract exactly what you're subtracting. So that's why we get that nice kind of area of tessellation around the edges there. But this stuff can be polished out pretty quick with just going in and using smooth, and you get a nice flush surface again. So that's a quick way to kind of go through your model and carve, trim, and punch holes into the surface very easily, just using any primitive or any subtool that you can import in or just generate inside of ZBrush. So we're going to use that DynaMesh process quite a bit for the subtraction as we continue building a helmet.